We can go ahead and get started. So my name is Isaac Levin. I'm an application development manager for Microsoft. What that title is I like to consider myself a customer-aligned developer advocate. So what I do is I go to customer sites, I'm aligned with customers, and I do things like this. So speaking about particular technologies, workshops, proof of concepts, and basically anything to better the developer experience for my customers. So I live in Norwalk, Connecticut. I work from home. And one of the things that I take pride in is I love .NET. I love .NET so much that I've decided that nothing is better than .NET. So I'm going to say some very opinionated things during this talk. My views do not equate to the views of my employer. So I just want to be 100% clear there. So I'm on GitHub and Twitter, Isaac2004. I'm too far in the process to change that name, and I regret that name. So, but anyway, if you want to follow me, I tweet about things, and yeah, I have a couple of repos that might be interesting. So the title of this talk is What to Expect When You're Expecting ASP.NET Core 3. Who here has played around with ASP.NET Core 3? About a third of the room. Cool. So one thing that I love to say at the onset when I do this talk is .NET is, in my opinion, the platform to build anything, right? So, now especially that you can do desktop client development for Windows with .NET Core 3 starting when 3.0 drops, the full gamut of the developer experience is now there. We're going to talk about some of the things that are coming to .NET Core 3, some of the things that are changing, but primarily this talk's going to be focused on the website. So, one of the things that I like to call out is who here owns a Samsung TV, right? That's been built in the last 2 years. Oh man, really? Well, so if you've bought a Samsung TV, it might be 3 years. In the last couple of years, Tizen, the operating system, is actually .NET Core. Everybody just nodded their heads, so that's awesome. So what that means is that it's not just building apps for the desktop or apps for the web. We're talking about things like IoT and the edge, right? So being able to build apps that can kind of run anywhere. And that's the whole concept around .NET, right? We want our programming language and our stack to be accessible to every developer, right? So Preview 9 came out last week. Has anybody played around with it? No? Has anybody tried Preview 8? Cool. All right. Has tried any preview? Who here knows what ASP.NET Core is? Awesome. Everybody raised their hand. Cool. If not, the door's that way. You're not going to learn anything new if you don't know anything, right? So let's talk about first the major changes to .NET, right? So obviously the biggest change for .NET starting in Core 3 is the desktop is coming to .NET Core. Right? So that means if you write Windows Forms or WPF, you can now write those applications on top of .NET Core. What that means, though, I want to be explicitly clear, you cannot build Linux applications with .NET Core, right? You can build Windows desktop applications. There are other ways that you can build Linux and Mac OS desktop clients, but for this particular thing, it's very important to call out that this is still a Windows thing. So, but what are the gains to bringing the desktop experience, the desktop development experience to .NET Core? Number one, .NET Core, the performance of it is substantially better, and the reason why that is because it's not tightly coupled to Windows anymore, right? As everybody here probably knows, .NET Core is a cross-platform thing, so it can run on Linux, Mac OS, right? So you're no longer tied to 25, 30 years of development that the Windows platform currently is, right? There are also things in Windows 10 especially, so like high DPI support for accessibility, it allows you to better use the leading technologies and the things that are more valuable to the users of your applications, right? So, those are some things to call out. Another big thing that's coming out with .NET Core 3 is C# 8. So has everybody here followed some of the C# 8 stuff? Yeah? So one thing to call out about a C# 8 is that .NET Core, or C# 8 is the first version of C# that some features will not be available on .NET Framework. Everybody just looked up like, what? So what that means is that in order to take full advantage of C# 8 and all of its features that are rolling out, you need to be running .NET Core. Because actually changes were made underlying to the runtime of .NET Core to accommodate some of the changes for C# 8. So it's important to call out. So if you're on .NET Framework, it's very important that some C# 8 things are just not going to work. So I'm not going to go into like the main features of C# 8. I think there's actually a talk here about C#, and if there's not, there's tons of resources available on docs.microsoft.com, as well as miscellaneous blogs about what C# 8 is coming. The biggest thing, in my opinion, that's really, really interesting is async streams. So the thought of not having to load an entire data set into memory, being able to get it on the fly is really, really valuable. So, and also with .NET Core 3 is a new version of .NET Standard. So is everybody here familiar with what .NET Standard is to an extent? So .NET Standard is basically a contract to existing APIs that exist, right? So 2.0, which is the current newest version of .NET Standard, has around 32,000 APIs. So when you talk about APIs, you're talking about like systems.collection.generic or system.io or whatever, right? So those are APIs. And so being able to take full advantage of all the things that .NET Framework hit, but in a contract-based approach where it doesn't matter if you're developing .NET Core, .NET Framework, Mono, whatever, you can still target .NET Standard and get the full experience. So with 2.1, we're adding an additional 3,000 APIs to .NET Standard. The most proficient one is span of T. So if you don't know what span of T is, it basically allows you to allocate at a lower level so you can get better performance. So you can do more memory management inside of .NET Core instead of having, using the typical things. So what does that mean? It means that Microsoft was able to actually build out a new Json parser that's more performant than JSON.NET. Everybody here has used JSON.NET, right? Yeah. So the de facto standard is actually shipped with some of our .NET templates, as early as last year, right? So we're decoupling the dependency on JSON.NET, and we built our own. When I say we, I mean the product group. I didn't do any of it, but so we built our own JSON serializer, and the goal is to have feature parity with JSON.NET. And how do we do that? We hired the guy who wrote JSON.NET. It's not just that, obviously, but one of the things is that we're taking advantage of span of T to get better memory allocation for performance, so serialization is faster. So that's the goal. And then finally, one thing that's coming to .NET Core, which is really valuable, is this concept of single file executables, right? So being able to publish your entire application into one exe instead of having a bunch of DLLs and maybe some configurations or whatever, right? So you can actually publish an executable and give it to someone and they can run that executable. Cool. And by the way, if anybody has any questions, we can stop and have a discussion. Oh, really? Okay, yes, sir.
Single file executable, is that solely for like that works for like if you've got a web API app?
So currently, so the question was, how does single file executables work for web? And the short answer is they don't really, right? Because an exe is very much a operating system file extension, right? So if people, let me just take a step back and talk about how like .NET Core currently works to run your apps, right? So when you publish a version of .NET Core app wherever, so in your directory there's a bunch of DLLs, right? So, but there's nothing to actually that gets executed. So what happens with things like IIS and Nginx and things like that is that the .NET.exe process gets run by IIS and it targets that particular DLL. So if you have like my API.dll, it's like .NET.exe, myapp.dll, and then it spins up Kestrel to run your application. So that's how that works. So going forward, instead of being reliant on .NET.exe, it's actually being bundled as a part of that. So your exe is actually .NET.exe running with your DLL. It's obviously more complicated than that, but that's the easiest way that I can kind of summarize what's going on. So you're no longer dependent on having to call .NET.exe targeting your DLL. It's going to be done for you with that single file executable. Make sense? Cool. Did you have a question?
Yeah, for the .NET Standard API.
Yes.
Are those integrated into Net Core 3 application by default, or is it something you opt into integrating with?
So the question is, .NET Standard 2.1 are the APIs that are coming in, are they bundled into .NET Core application? The short answer is no. So typically, like I think of .NET Standard as like your replacement for base class libraries or like class libraries. So like if you have a client project like a desktop client or a web client or whatever, you're going to call into like your business layer, your domain layer, or whatever, right? And that's always a class project. So going forward, .NET Standard should be the project type of those libraries, right? So that means that if you have a project that's just a class library that targets .NET Standard 2.0, you can build a .NET Framework 4. Whatever application or a .NET Core 2. Whatever application or mono, and you target that project and you get access to all the baseline APIs that are a part of .NET Standard. Yes?
If I was to implement .NET Standard and roll it up to like a WebAssembly Blazor application, what's that going to make the client decide?
Do you want to look? Do you want to see that? So the question is if I was to build a Blazor application, and I haven't even gone to Blazor yet, but people are already asking me about Blazor because that's how this talk works. So if I have a Blazor application, I want to target .NET Standard, what does that look like? I promise you I'll show you a demo that does just that. Can we hit the brakes on it? Cool. All right, so I'm gonna keep moving on from this. If people have questions, just interrupt me again. But I wanted to call out what is changing, right? Because with every new version of anything, things break. Your cheese gets moved, to quote whoever created that saying. But at the end of the day, what is changing? So the number one thing to call out is that starting with 3.0, ASP.NET Core applications cannot target .NET Framework. Has anybody tried targeting .NET Framework? Right. So the goal of that is to get full access to the entire .NET Framework APIs, right? But you still get like the project structure. So you still get like program.cs and startup.cs, and you're using JSON-based configuration. So that option is no longer possible because of a lot of reasons that I don't want to get into. So that's the biggest thing. So going forward, if you're going to build an ASP.NET Core application starting in 3, you can no longer target .NET Framework. You can only target .NET Core. So another big thing is that starting in 2.2, or it might even been in 2.1 of .NET Core, ASP.NET Core especially, is we started to see the .NET team remove a lot of dependencies out of the meta packages. The meta packages being ASP.NET Core.app. Right? So ASP.NET Core app is a meta package that basically includes a lot of dependencies to other packages. So if you're familiar with what that package store has, you'd have things like auth and entity framework and all these things built into it. That's no longer going to be the case going forward. And the reason for that is because they want that runtime, that package store, to be smaller and to be more portable. So in the situation, they understand, I think the .NET team realized maybe we don't want to force entity framework on people. Maybe we don't want to force, JSON.NET because it's the only option that's really valid, but not anymore. And Roslyn and things like that, right? So if you need those, you can still get them via NuGet, like you've been able to forever. But it's one thing to call out, right? Is that these things aren't included by default anymore when you like .NET new a new application. Another thing that started in 2.1 and it's going to aggressively move out is this concept of the SPA services and node services libraries. So who here has built like an Angular app using like .NET new Angular or .NET new React, right? Yeah. So in the past, those project templates depended on some libraries that are no longer really necessary for a couple of reasons. One, all of the modern SPA frameworks have their own CLI. So it really doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel and spin up a Node.js server behind the scenes to compile your stuff. Like, just have the CLI do that. So, going forward, the recommended approach is use the CLI that comes with your SPA and use this SPA services.extensions to do the hooking. right? So what that means is that in .NET 5, which I'm not going to talk about .NET 5 at all, but it's going to come out in some time in the future. I don't know really much about it because I'm not on the product team. But if when .NET 5 comes out, SPA services will no longer be available. Thing to call out. So we can pause for questions, or we can keep chugging along. Keep chugging? Cool. So one of the things that Microsoft takes pride in is when we build a web application, we can provide a lot of different options, almost to the fact that personally I believe it's too many options, right? But one of the best things about options is that you have them, because if you only had one option, you'd kind of be SOL. So what does that mean? So in the ASP.NET Core space, we have this concept of server-side applications, right? So server-side application would be like your MVC, your API, SignalR, and so forth, right? And you get all these great experiences, right? So you get security and identity, and you get Razor syntax and things like that, right? But we understand that customers maybe don't want to build just server-side applications, right? Maybe you want to build something a bit different. So you can leverage a client type of programming model, right? So Blazor obviously being one, components, and then obviously, there's pick your SPA, right? Well, you can just pick 3 SPAs in my opinion, but pick your SPA of choice. So Angular, Vue, and Reactive. People didn't pick that up. So what that means is that you can build applications for the client that use the Web 2.0 experience, right? I really hate the Web 2.0 phrase, but basically that just means that's because it's been around for like 20 years. Like, where's Web 3.0, right? Web 2.0 is basically just like a seamless experience that doesn't involve, hey, let's post back every single time we want to do anything, right? So giving the ability to have our users or our customers have that experience is really important. And then obviously, we don't want to be completely dependent on our server application to do work in some particular scenarios. We have long-running processes. We have situations where servers need to call into other servers to do things, right? So we have some new templates or some new programming models that accommodate that. And we're going to talk about that through this talk. So I'm going to build an application that is very similar to an order application, right? So I want to be able, these are my requirements that from the business. I want a Web 2.0 application, and I want to be able to submit orders, but those orders can take X amount of time. So I don't want the customer to wait for that particular order to be completed, right? I want something that runs in the background that picks up orders and processes them. Right? This is a very common scenario in basically every business, right? So I'm going to build an application using the new features of .NET Core 3 or ASP.NET Core 3 to take advantage of that. So when we talk about a full stack application, so we have obviously the server, we have the client, and we have the backend, right? So we're going to start off with Blazor because only Blazor, right? People only care about Blazor. Did anybody go to the other Blazor? There's a Blazor talk yesterday, and there's a WASM talk. Did anybody go to those? So if you're expecting a similar level of content, I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you that. Like the person that does those talks, Ed, he's awesome. He's way closer aligned with the product group in this particular area than I am. So, but I know Blazor pretty well, so we'll be able to talk about that. And on the back end, we're going to take advantage of workers. So worker is a new template that we're going to talk about. So and for the communication back and forth, like that process that's checking in, we're going to use gRPC. So we're going to talk about Blazor, workers, and gRPC as a part of this. That's what we're going to use to build our application. So let's focus on the front end first. So for the folks that don't know, what is Blazor? Blazor is just you can run C# in the browser. And that's my talk. Have a good night. So no, but it allows you to build client-side applications without depending on JavaScript, right? As simple as that. So one of the things that's really valuable about Blazor is that just because you are using a different programming language to do C#-like or JavaScript-like interaction on your UI, it doesn't mean that you can't use JavaScript. So Blazor gives you the ability to interop, which means communicate back and forth with JavaScript. So you can have C# calling into JavaScript, JavaScript calling into C#, and it all just magically works. How it magically works, I don't know, but it magically works. And one of the things to call out is that, based on the gentleman's question earlier, it's C# and it's .NET Core, so you have the ability to access .NET Standard and all of the APIs that come along with it. So you get a better experience, right? And when I show you some of the code, if you haven't seen Blazor, you'll be like, oh wow, like that's substantially easier to understand than the 400 files that come when you ng new an application, right? So one thing to call out, and we'll talk about Blazor, like the different versions of Blazor, but Blazor for WebAssembly is now out of experimental and official preview. What does that mean? It means that the .NET product team, they have made the decision that they're going to turn it into a full feature product, which means that sometime in the future, Blazor for WebAssembly will be available out of preview. So what does that mean right now? I do not recommend using your writing production apps with Blazor targeting WebAssembly. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The tooling isn't 100% baked yet. There's some issues with file download and performance and things like that the team is trying to fix. So you can choose between Blazor on the client or Blazor on the server. So Blazor on the client, it uses a technology called WebAssembly. I'm just going to talk about WebAssembly for 1 second because I'm not smart enough to fully describe what it is. But WebAssembly is basically, it's a process that allows you to compile your application code down into bytecode, which runs on the browser without the need of JavaScript, without the need of anything else, right? So Blazor runs on top of WebAssembly, and from there, you're able to execute C# code on the browser. And that's all I'm going to talk about WebAssembly because I don't want to say something that's wrong. And then there's server-side Blazor. Server-side Blazor, in my opinion, is very interesting because they saw that this isn't going to be done as fast as they want. So what do? They created a similar experience for the end user, but they're using SignalR to do the work. So what does that mean? So they're creating a SignalR connection that interacts with a SignalR server on the server side. And what happens is that the deltas, when you do interactions on the website, like you change a route or you click a button or you update the UI in any capacity, a SignalR call is made to the server, and then the deltas of the UI get passed back. And what the server-side Blazor mechanism does on the front end is actually re-render the UI. So in my opinion, it's a really elegant thing, right? So you have a Web 2.0 experience, but it's all done on the server side. What are the caveats to that? You always need a connection to the server to be able to get this to work. With this one, you don't because it's all browser. So in a situation where, hey, I lose connection to the server, server-side Blazor is no longer going to work. So it's an important thing to call out. So obviously, server-side Blazor is shipping with .NET Core 3. That's sometime in the future. I've heard next year. I've heard whenever .NET 5 drops, which I've heard is 2020. I'm not going to speculate. So there's also one additional thing to call out as well about client-side Blazor. So client-side Blazor, by default, it's literally just one project, right? So it's a web project that has WebAssembly built into it. But we understand that you still might want to call into an API, right? Or like this gentleman said, take advantage of a .NET Standard library behind the scenes. So what we did, and when I mean we, I mean I actually did this. I actually updated the templates. We updated the templates for the WASM version of Blazor to allow users to specify, and I apologize at the back if you can't read this very well, an option when you run a CLI command, whether or not you want hosted or not. What hosted means is that if you want a hosted version of the project, it'll actually create 3 projects. It'll create your WASM Blazor client project, it'll create your API, and it'll create a shared .NET Standard library, right, by default. If you don't want hosted, it'll just going to create 1 project for you. So what that does is it just basically scaffolds more projects for you. So it's optional. By default, it's false. So if you just do .NET new Blazor WASM, it's going to give you 1 project. It's also available in Visual Studio as well. So if you create a new Blazor app to Visual Studio, you have a checkbox that says ASP.NET Core hosted. Yes, sir. Is there going to be tree shaking? So the answer to the question is initially there's no tree shaking. So one of the things that not me, we as in Microsoft, we're trying to make, like I said, one of the issues with client-side Blazor is the fact that it's so big. And the reason why that is because there's no ahead of time compiling and there's no tree shaking. So one of the things that we're trying to accomplish is being able to shake out the methods. First off, does everybody know what tree shaking is? Okay. So what tree shaking is basically so for instance, I have a class that has 5 methods, right? But my application only uses one of those methods. What tree shaking does is think of if you were to take a tree and you were to pick it up by the bottom and shake it, and all the leaves fall out that aren't needed, right? So 4 methods would be dropped out of the compiled binary, so the binary is smaller, right? So what that means is that tree shaking allows you to be able to get a smaller DLL, which means a smaller footprint, which means a smaller download size. So to answer your question, that's one of the things that's stopping client-based or WASM-based Blazor from being able to ship immediately or whatever, is because we acknowledge that the download size is too big still because we don't have tree shaking. What I imagine what's going to happen is, so the story with .NET 5 is we're bringing the best bits of the Mono framework, which is basically a Linux-based open source version of .NET, and the best versions of the .NET framework and the best bits of .NET Core, and bringing it all together into one code base. And one of the huge benefits to the Mono project is it has ahead of time compiling and tree shaking. So the long and short of it is, I would imagine that at the same time .NET 5 gets its tree shaking thing figured out, we'll start to see more and more progress as it pertains to client-side Blazor. Cool. All right. So what I want to do is I just want to do a quick demo of the different things that happen with, or the different project types that come up with Blazor. So I'm going to just hunch over this laptop, so I apologize if I don't make eye contact with any of you. So if I go to my terminal, by the way, complete side note, everybody use this, right? The new Microsoft terminal that we built? No? Who here has seen this before? Okay, a few of you. Off on a tangent, but what this basically is it's a new terminal that Microsoft has built that basically gives you a more featureful experience with command line, right? So for instance, you have things like it's tagged, right? And you can have different profiles. So for instance, I can have a new command window, I can use WSL, so I can spin up an Ubuntu version right here, and they're all tabbed based. One thing that's also really cool is this too small in the back for anybody? No? Well, I'm going to zoom in anyway, right? So you can zoom in to make it bigger, right? And you can fully customize it, and it's all JSON based. And another really cool thing is it has tmux support. So if I go, whoops, I can split panes, right? You can also split panes horizontally and vertically, which is pretty cool, right? But anyway, that's not why you're here. You don't care about this. So I'm just going to exit out of all this stuff. Okay. So I'm in a dev folder. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run some .NET commands. So .NET, let's do version. So as you can see, I'm on preview 9. So let's .NET new and take a look at some of the stuff that's coming. Let's zoom out, right? And I apologize that the wrapping here is kind of bummer. But so I have .NET new Blazor. I have .NET new. Oh no. Uh-oh. Okay, we'll figure out. Oh, so never mind. So there's Blazor server and there's Blazor WASM. I got very concerned because those aren't the short names that they're supposed to be, but I think it's because they're being wrapped. So if I do .NET new Blazor server, and let's just call it so -O basically says that's the name of the project, and it's going to create a folder of that. So if I do that, it's going to create a server-side Blazor application. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go in here, and since I can't use Visual Studio, I'm just going to open this up in Visual Studio Code. And while that's doing its thing, I'm going to .NET Run. So I'm going to run my application. Okay, so all that stuff is going on, and while my computer's freaking out because I had to do like 6 things at once. So everybody here is familiar with .NET Core and how you basically load up an application, right? So you have a program.cs that calls into a host builder, and that calls into your startup, which wires up your configuration, your dependency injection, all that stuff, right? So when you build a server-side Blazor application, so your program.cs is the same, because it's still a server-based application. Your startup.cs, all it really does is it has a call in to an add server-side Blazor extension, and it maps a Blazor Hub endpoint. That Blazor Hub endpoint is a SignalR connection, right? So if you take a look, let's actually look at the app that loaded. I said let's take a look at the app that loaded. Oh, do I need to actually load a browser? That's a bummer. All right, so let's do localhost 5000. So this is the template Blazor app, right? People have probably seen this. What you can do is there's a counter here. You can click that counter, and there's no postback, obviously, and there's an API call that comes in here, right? So that's pretty cool. So what does that actually look like? So if you take a look at the pages, so all Blazor UI files, which include the code and the UI, are .razor files. If you want to decouple the code, you can do .razor.cs, which gives you a very similar experience to web forms, but it's not web forms. It's not Silverlight either. I got to call that out too. It's not Silverlight either, because everybody asks that. So what does the counter look like, right? So if you look here, look at the counter page. So all there is there's a button and there's a label that looks like it's data bound to something, right? So what does that look like? So if you look here with my pointer, so you see, there's a page directive which specifies what the route's going to be, and then there is a data-bound current count variable that is assigned to an integer. So everything that's inside the code bracket, it's C#, right? So this is actual C# that you can run. And as you can see, this button class, this is a regular button class. It has an on-click event handler that calls into this event handler right here. So I'm not going to tell you what this code does because you're all adults, but and that's what that does, right? So if I take a look at the fetch data, so as you can see here, there's a table and it's getting data from somewhere, right? So if I look at the fetch data, so it's a UI, there's a table with a for each here. So this is Razor syntax. Most people probably get what that is. Inside here is where the C# code that runs, right? So I have an array of an object, and then on initialize async, which basically means when the page loads, make a get request, right? So again, it's C# code that runs in the browser. But if you don't believe me when I say that it runs in the browser, let's just do this. Let's spin up this guy. Go to network, and let's refresh this page. Right, so when I'm just going to maximize this. So what happens? So you call fetch data, which is just the page, right? And then there's this blazor.server.js. That's your SignalR connection, basically. And as you can see, let's just do this. Can I clear this? Yeah, let's clear that. And then let's hop around. Do. There's nothing happening here because I'm not making any server calls. I'm making SignalR server calls, which are a bit different. But one thing to call out is that I'm doing things like I'm getting data, I'm hopping around, and nothing is changing on the client side. Everything is changing on the server side, and the connection is sending the render tree of the DOM that updates. Cool. Does anybody have any questions about server-side Blazor? I'm going to hop over to WebAssembly-based Blazor now. No questions are good or bad, depending on who you ask. So let's just do .NET new Blazor WASM. And let's just do O, and let's just call it WASM. Oh. All right, so this is going to create me just a application. So it's not hosted, so it's just going to create the WASM project, just one project, right? So if I go in here and same thing, Code Insiders, and then .NET Run. Okay. So while that project is loading, we're going to take a look and see what the differences are, right? So as you can see, your program.cs is different. You're using a Blazor startup and you're using a Blazor WebAssembly host, right? So you're not using the default host builder for ASP.NET Core applications. You're basically routing all of your bootstrapping through this Blazor WebAssembly host. So what does your startup look like? Your startup doesn't have anything in it because everything's being done on the client, right? So you do not. So all you're doing is you're saying, hey, Kestrel, point at this WebAssembly application. But one thing that's really important to call out is if you take a look, at like my counter, does that code look really similar to everybody? Because it's the exact same code. So server-side Blazor and client-side Blazor have the exact same code syntax and code process for their Razor files. So what does that mean? Theoretically, you could have a server-side Blazor application that you eventually port to a client-side Blazor application without a ton of work. Pretty cool, right? So if I hop over, let's do this, and let's do localhost. Right, so same experience, right? The template's the same because the template's supposed to be the same. But if I take a look and inspect, I'm just going to go to my network tab, and I'm going to refresh the page. So as you can see here, it's a different experience when you look at the network tab, right? So you see blazor.webassembly.js, that's basically the mechanism that bootstraps WebAssembly, mono.js, and then what are all these things here? They're DLLs. So the initial thing that people see when they see this is, oh my God, you're downloading DLLs to the browser, you monster, right? So obviously, people immediately have concerns about that, but one of the benefits to doing things like this inside the browser is that you're only encapsulated by the browser sandbox. So that means that just because you have DLLs being downloaded to the browser doesn't mean that those DLLs can be executed outside of the browser. It's very important to call out, right? So if anybody from security says, oh, you're doing that, that's not safe, you can push back and say, no, not so much. So. And one of the good things to call out as well is that this doesn't need connection to a server at all because it's just one project that's doing all the things on the client side. Sweet. All right, so let's go back, stop this. And this is when it's going to start getting interesting because I don't have Visual Studio. Sweet. So we talked about the client. Does everybody get what I'm going to do when I show the order application, right? I'm going to use Blazor, whether it's server-side or client-side. So for the process that runs concurrently to basically check for orders, I'm going to use worker service in gRPC. So what is worker service? So worker service, basically, in my opinion, it's like the new version of a console app, right? So the first question that I say that is like, why would you ever replace a console app? What is the most annoying thing that you have to do when you build a new console app, right? You don't have dependency injection, you don't have configuration, you don't have logging, right? All these things that you love when you build an ASP.NET Core application, you don't have them in a console app. Well, if you can wire it up yourself, but who wants to do this? Every single time you build a console app that you want logging and dependency injection, right? This is not that cool. So what worker service does is it gives you a console-based application that uses all of the goodness of the ASP.NET Core startup process. So you get built-in DI for better testing, you get built-in logging, you get built-in configuration, right? So, and one of the good things is that it's wired to the lifetimes of the operating system, so you can build Windows services with this, you can build Linux daemons, you can build web jobs. It gives you more breadth in your ability to build applications. So I highly recommend in the future, if you need to build a console app that does something, build a worker service instead. So what does a worker service actually look like? So it's actually pretty straightforward. So if I get out of here and if I go .NET new worker -o worker, and then this thing loads up, and then I go into the worker, and then I code insiders. Probably should have a script that does those two things at the same time. .NET run. Okay, so if you look at the program.cs for our worker service, it looks very similar. Instead of calling into use startup and all of that, you're passing in a class that says use a hosted service. That's the big difference. But you're still generating a builder, so you're still getting all of the builder experience. So logging and dependency injection, all of that. If you look at the worker service, it looks a lot like a console app, right? So what is this thing actually doing? All it's doing is just looping, because it's a template, so who really cares what it does? But so it's looping, and every second it loops, and then you just have this execution here. So one thing to call that's really important is that you could easily build a console app inside of your while loop, or you can terminate it if you only want one process through. So it gives you just all of the experience here, right? So you have a logger that's using dependency injection. I could actually wire up all of the stuff for reading stuff from config as well. Okay. Anybody have any questions about worker service? Cool. And I'm going to start going really fast because I got like 8 minutes left. And then for the final thing, so as a part of the requirements for my application, so the client application and the server application, they write to a database. I don't want the worker service to have access to the database because of a lot of reasons. But one, because I said so. So I'm going to call into my server-based application using gRPC to get the data. So my worker service has no idea about the data store at all. So I'm going to use gRPC. What does gRPC stand for? So the RPC stands for remote procedure call, but the G stands for a recursive thing. So right now, the G stands for gRPC because sure, why not? Google, that's cool. But what is gRPC? So gRPC allows you to get a really, really performant server-to-server interaction, right? So if anybody here has built like a WCF app that does like a server-to-server, like this is an interesting replacement for that, right? And since it's using it's using a process that's been built by Google, it's got polyglot environment support and all these sort of things, right? And everything is built using a protobuf file. A protobuf file, it's a file format that the tooling in Visual Studio will actually build a C# representation class of that contract. So similar to like what WCF does. So I'm going to show you the entire application. So this is going to be fun because I'm going to be in, did I not open the right thing? Console app with startup. Let me just open this folder. Order app, select folder. Alrighty. So as you can see when this loads up, is that I have 3 projects, right? I got a worker project, I got my app project, which is my server-side Blazor application, and then I have a shared class library, .NET Standard, which you were saying earlier, right? So being able to target .NET Standard. So what does the app look like? So the app, if I look at my index file, it's got a table in there, it's got some buttons, and it's doing some stuff in code, right? So let me actually do this. So let me just back this guy up. So is it Core 3 Talk, Order App? I forgot the folder name, so I apologize. So let's just do Order App. Let's .NET run this. And then I'm going to hop over here. this is the awesomeness of the terminal, right? So I can actually run two applications at the same time. Core 3 talk, and then if I order app, and then order app.worker, and then I .NET run this too. So what you're going to see, so this application runs up, right? So this is it's building an ASP.NET Core application, and as you can see here as well, it's building like a gRPC endpoint as well. So, and then I have this worker here that's processing orders. So if I go over and just spin up a new browser, here's my application, right? Isn't it lovely? As you can tell, I'm a server-side guy, not a client guy. But so it's quite simple. Like I'm gonna enter an order. So I want to order a hot dog because why not? I'm gonna order one hot dog, and that hot dog is really expensive for some reason. So if I click Save Order, it gives me a pending status, right? And if I go over here, so this is my worker service that's running. So it picks up that an order has been processed, and then if I reload, it's been processed. So cool, right? So how does it actually doing that? So if I go over and take a look at the worker service, I'm making an HTTP client connection, or a gRPC client connection, sorry, that hits a get new order. And then if it gets an order, it updates, right? So one thing to call out is that the worker service is calling into the Blazor app, which has a gRPC endpoint on it. And then the gRPC endpoint is interacting with the database. Cool, right? So what does that look like on the order app side? So literally, all I have on the order app side is I have my Blazor stuff, but then I have this protobuf file, which specifies that I have an order reply, an order request, and then this get new order, right? So what happens is a C# file gets generated for this, which is, to be honest, is generated, so it's hard to read, so I'm not going to show it to you folks. But what happens is you create this protobuf file, and then in your CS proj, you specify that you have a protobuf file, and you want to register it as a server. And on your client side, so your worker service, you have the same protobuf file, exact same, and in your project, where is it? Where is it? It's too big, I can't read. You specify that it's a client, right? So that's how you do that. So you specify, hey, this is a gRPC client application. It's going to call into the service contracts for the protobuf files, the same on both sides, and then you wire up, this is the endpoint to my gRPC service, and then it all just magically works. Right, so that's pretty cool. So everybody got a pretty good understanding of how this code is doing all its stuff? Yes, sir. So the worker service, it doesn't have any knowledge of the database. All it does is it makes an API call, right? So the worker service is just a console app. Think of it as a console app that's in a continuous loop. And all it's continually doing is making an API call checking for new orders. If it has a new order, it processes that order. That's all the worker service does. On the Blazor app side, there is two endpoints. There's the web application that you see the client, and then there's the gRPC endpoint. The worker service is making an API call to the gRPC endpoint. The gRPC endpoint processes the data, basically updates the order that's processed, and sends a response back. Make sense? Cool. Does anybody have any other questions? Yes, sir. You definitely could. Yeah. SignalR, you can do whatever you want, man. Cool. So the question was basically, could you just not have to click that refresh button? Yeah, you definitely could. You can wire that up. All right. So I'm going to finish up now. So I'm going to talk about this really quick. These are all the new things that are coming in ASP.NET Core 3. So the big thing is we talked about the project type, but obviously C# is coming to Razor and MVC. This new system.text.json is going to be available as a part of .NET Standard 2.1, which is going to give you faster JSON serialization. There's going to be a C++ client for SignalR, and because we're bringing desktop, so WinForms, to .NET Core, you gotta support Kerberos, right? Right? So like, if you don't know what Kerberos is, it's a very antiquated authentication mechanism that has to be supported because a lot of WinForms applications use it for authentication. So it's now coming to .NET Core 3. Identity Server. So Identity Server is an open source package that is I believe it's I can never remember if it's claims-based or role-based. I get them confused. A role-based or claims-based authorization mechanism. So it's pretty well known. If you look at Identity Server, it's been around for a handful of years, and it plugs into ASP.NET Core, as a first-class citizen now. So here's a schedule. Every time I do this talk, I have to update this slide. So Preview 9 is out right now, and .NET Core 3 is going to launch at .NET Kampf. So if you don't know what .NET Kampf is, it's a 3-day online conference that's going to be around the launch of our product. So you're going to see, folks from the product group. You're going to see internet celebrities like Scott Hanselman. Scott hates it when I call him internet celebrity. But you're going to see, the product group. So you're going to see guys like Dan Roth, John Galloway, and then there's also going to be community members that are speaking. I'm going to be speaking at .NET Kampf about application insights on the 25th. So I highly recommend you take a look at that if you're interested in app insights. And I'm like right over time. So first off, I want to thank you all so much for coming out to my talk. It was a great experience for me. I hope it was for you. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your last day at Music City Tech, Code, Agile, Data, whatever you're attending. So on the left-hand side is a link to, it's basically like a form to fill out. And what it will do is if you want to sign up for more information about .NET, you can. But it's also going to have the links to this slide deck and the demo application that I showed. On the right-hand side is a survey because I don't do this as my day job, but I'm always trying to grow as a speaker. So I would really appreciate if you have time, if you want to fill out a 5-question survey. And like I said earlier to the folks that showed up a little bit later, I have all this swag that I'm not taking home with me, so please grab some. Grab some for your wife, your kids, your friends, your colleagues. You'll be the coolest guy for like 2 minutes. So again, thank you so much for coming out. We can ask some questions. I'll be hanging out around if you want to ask some questions upstairs. But thank you so much.